What happens when one of Britain's most respected actors walks onto a daytime talk show expecting a pleasant conversation about his career, only to be blindsided by a host who seems determined to make him look like the villain? In just 34 seconds of brutal questioning, Denise Welch would push Sean Bean to his absolute breaking point, sparking one of the most shocking walkouts in British television history. The cameras were rolling, the studio audience was settled in their seats. Sean Bean, the man who had survived countless on-screen deaths, who had faced down orcs in Middle-earth and led the Stark family in Westeros, was about to face something far more uncomfortable than any fictional battle. He was about to sit down with the panel of loose women for what he thought would be a standard promotional interview. Sean walked onto the set with his usual quiet confidence. He wasn't the type to seek attention or cause drama. He was there to talk about his new project, share a few laughs, and head home. The audience applauded as he took his seat, flashing a polite smile to the hosts. But something felt off from the very beginning. The energy at the table was strange, tense, even. Denise Welch sat at the center of the panel, and from the moment Sean sat down, her demeanor was cold. There was no warmth in her greeting, no genuine interest in having him there. It was as if she had already decided how this interview was going to go, and it wasn't going to be friendly. The interview started innocuously enough. One of the other panelists asked Sean about his latest role, and he began to answer, speaking thoughtfully about the character he was playing and what drew him to the project. He was articulate, humble, and clearly passionate about his work. But before he could finish his thought, Denise cut him off. "Can I just stop you there?" she said, her voice sharp and dismissive. "I think what everyone really wants to know is why you keep taking these roles where you die. I mean, is it because you're not good enough to be the lead who survives?" The studio fell silent. The other panelists exchanged uncomfortable glances. The audience shifted in their seats. Sean's expression remained calm, but you could see the flicker of surprise in his eyes. He let out a small, awkward laugh, clearly trying to brush off what was an incredibly rude question. "Well, I wouldn't say that," he replied, keeping his tone light. "I think it's just become a bit of a running joke, hasn't it? I've been fortunate enough to play some really complex characters, and sometimes those characters meet unfortunate ends. It's all part of the story." But Denise wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "A running joke," she repeated, her voice dripping with condescension. "Right. Or maybe it's just that casting directors don't trust you to carry a film all the way through. Have you ever thought about that?" The room grew even more tense. One of the other hosts tried to interject, to steer the conversation in a different direction, but Denise talked right over her. She was on a roll now, and she wasn't going to let anyone stop her. Sean's jaw tightened. He was still trying to be polite, still trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was just trying to be provocative for the sake of good television. Maybe this was some kind of misguided attempt at banter. But there was a limit to how much disrespect anyone could take, even someone as patient as Sean Bean. "I don't think that's fair," he said, his voice firm but measured. "I've had a long career, and I'm very proud of the work I've done. I don't need to justify my choices to anyone." Denise scoffed. Actually scoffed, on live television, in front of a studio audience and millions of viewers at home. "Oh, here we go," she said, rolling her eyes. "The sensitive actor routine. Can't take a bit of criticism, can you?" Sean stared at her, genuinely taken aback. This wasn't criticism. This was something else entirely. This was a personal attack, unprovoked and unwarranted. He hadn't come on the show to be berated. He hadn't done anything to deserve this treatment. "I can take criticism just fine," he said, his voice growing colder. "But what you're doing isn't criticism. You're just being rude for no reason," the audience murmured. Some people gasped. You could feel the atmosphere in the studio shift. This wasn't playful anymore. This wasn't entertainment. This was uncomfortable, and everyone could sense it. But instead of backing down, instead of apologizing or even just moving on to another topic, Denise doubled down. She actually doubled down. "Rude," she said, her voice rising. "I'm being rude? You come on this show, you sit at this table, and you expect us to just fawn over you and ask you softball questions? This is Loose Women, not some press junket where everyone kisses your feet." Sean shook his head slowly, disbelief written all over his face. "I didn't expect anyone to kiss my feet," he said quietly. "I expected basic respect. That's all." One of the other panelists tried to jump in again, clearly desperate to defuse the situation. "Sean, tell us about working with the director on this film," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "That must have been an amazing experience." But Denise wasn't having it. She cut her colleague off mid-sentence, turning her attention back to Sean with a venomous intensity. No, I want to address this, she said, because I think it's interesting that you're so defensive. If you're so confident in your career, why does a simple question bother you so much? Unless, of course, there's some truth to it. That was it. That was the moment. You could see it in Sean's face. The moment he realized that no matter what he said, no matter how polite or reasonable he tried to be, this woman was determined to make him the villain. She was determined to humiliate him on national television, and she wasn't going to stop. Sean took a deep breath. He looked down at his hands for a moment, as if gathering himself. When he looked back up, his expression was calm but resolute. "You know what?" he said, his voice steady. "I don't need to sit here and be spoken to like this. I came here to have a conversation, not to be insulted." Denise let out a harsh laugh. "Oh, so now you're going to play the victim?" she said mockingly. "You can dish it out in all your tough guy roles, but you can't take a little heat in real life?" Sean stood up, just stood up, right there in the middle of the interview. The studio went dead silent. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of what was unfolding. The other panelists looked horrified. The producers behind the cameras were probably panicking, but Sean didn't care. He'd had enough. "I'm not playing anything," he said, looking directly at Denise. "I'm simply choosing not to stay somewhere I'm not respected. There's a difference between asking challenging questions and being deliberately nasty. You've crossed a line." He began to remove his microphone, calmly and deliberately. No shouting, no theatrics, just quiet dignity in the face of appalling behavior. Denise's face flushed red. Whether from anger or embarrassment, it was hard to tell. But she wasn't about to let him leave without getting the last word in. "Fine, walk off," she spat. "Just proves my point, doesn't it? Can't handle the pressure. Can't handle a real conversation. Just another actor with an ego who can't take the truth." Sean paused. He could have just walked away. He could have left without saying another word. But he turned back to face her one more time. "The truth?" he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "The truth is that you've been hostile from the moment I sat down. I've done nothing to you. I've been nothing but polite. And yet you've gone out of your way to be cruel. That says a lot more about you than it does about me." The other panelists sat frozen, unsure of what to do or say. The audience was completely silent, watching this car crash unfold in real time. You could have heard a pin drop in that studio. Denise stood up too, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "How dare you?" she hissed. "You come onto my show, and you have the audacity to lecture me about how to do my job? Your show?" One of the other hosts muttered under her breath, but Denise ignored her. Sean shook his head, a sad smile on his face. "This isn't about your job," he said. "This is about basic human decency, and right now, you're not showing any." He placed his microphone on the chair and turned to the audience. "I'm sorry you had to witness this," he said to them, his voice sincere. "I really am. This isn't what I wanted. But I won't be disrespected, not by anyone." The audience erupted into applause. Not the polite, obligatory applause you usually hear on these shows. Real, genuine, supportive applause. They were on his side. They could see what was happening. They could see who the real problem was. Denise looked stunned. Absolutely stunned. The applause was like a slap in the face. Her own audience was applauding the guest who was walking off her show. The guest she had just spent the last several minutes attacking. "Unbelievable," she muttered, but her microphone picked it up. "Absolutely unbelievable." Sean walked toward the exit, his head held high. As he reached the edge of the set, one of the producers approached him, probably trying to convince him to stay, to smooth things over. But Sean shook his head politely and kept walking. He was done. Back at the table, chaos had erupted. The other panelists were talking over each other, some trying to salvage the show, others clearly upset with Denise. One of them turned to her directly. "That was completely out of order, Denise," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "You can't treat guests like that." But Denise was having none of it. "Oh, don't start," she snapped back. He was being oversensitive. If he can't handle a bit of questioning, he shouldn't be in this business. Another panelist jumped in. "That wasn't questioning. That was an attack. There's a difference. We're supposed to make guests feel welcome, not tear them apart." The argument continued as the cameras kept rolling. The producers were frantically trying to decide whether to cut to a commercial break or let this play out. The show had completely derailed. Meanwhile, backstage, Sean was gathering his things. Members of the crew approached him, apologizing profusely for what had happened. Some of them looked genuinely embarrassed to be associated with the show. Sean was gracious with all of them, thanking them for their kindness and assuring them that he held no ill will toward anyone except the person who had treated him so poorly. "It's not your fault," he told one particularly distressed production assistant. "You've all been lovely. This is on one person, and one person only." Back in the studio, they finally cut to a commercial break. The second the camera stopped rolling, the other panelists turned on Denise. "What were you thinking?" one of them demanded. "You just humiliated a guest on live television. Do you have any idea how bad this makes us all look?" Denise crossed her arms defensively. "I was trying to get a real answer out of him, not just the usual rehearsed nonsense we always get from actors." "By insulting him repeatedly?" another host shot back. "By questioning his talent and his career choices? That's not journalism, Denise. That's bullying." The makeup artist who had been standing nearby chimed in quietly. "The audience was clapping for him when he left. Not for you. That should tell you everything you need to know." Denise's face went even redder. She looked around the room, perhaps expecting someone to come to her defense, but no one did. Everyone knew she had gone too far. Everyone could see it. When the show came back from commercial, the energy was completely different. The remaining panelists tried their best to carry on, to discuss other topics and pretend like nothing had happened, but it was pointless. The damage was done. The interview with Sean Bean, or rather the disaster of an interview with Sean Bean, was all anyone would remember from that episode. Throughout the rest of the show, Denise was noticeably quieter. She barely spoke, and when she did, her usual confidence was gone. She looked rattled. She looked like someone who was beginning to realize that she had made a catastrophic mistake. One of the other hosts tried to address what had happened, to offer some kind of explanation or apology to the viewers. "We want to say that we're very sorry for the tension earlier in the show," she said carefully. "Things got a bit heated, and we understand that it was uncomfortable to watch. We have nothing but respect for Sean Bean and his incredible body of work. It was a diplomatic attempt at damage control, but it wasn't enough. The viewers at home weren't stupid. They had seen exactly what had happened. They had watched Denise Welch tear into a guest for no apparent reason, and they had watched that guest stand up for himself with grace and dignity." The show limped to its conclusion, ending on a somber note that was the complete opposite of the upbeat, chatty atmosphere these programs usually tried to maintain. As soon as the final credits rolled, the studio emptied quickly. The other panelists left without saying much to Denise. The crew packed up the equipment in near silence. Denise sat at the table for a moment alone, staring at the empty seat where Sean had been sitting just minutes before. Whatever she was thinking, whatever justification she was trying to come up with in her head, it didn't matter. The damage was irreversible. In the green room, Sean was already long gone. He had left the building as quickly as possible, not wanting to stick around for any awkward confrontations or forced apologies. He had said what he needed to say, and he had done what he needed to do. He had stood up for himself, and he had done it with class. The interview, or what remained of it, would become one of the most talked about moments in British daytime television history, not because of anything particularly insightful that was said, not because of any groundbreaking revelations, but because it was a perfect example of what happens when a host lets their ego get in the way of doing their job properly. Sean Bean had walked onto that set as a guest, expecting to be treated with the basic courtesy that any guest deserves. Instead, he was met with hostility, condescension, and outright rudeness. And rather than sit there and take it, rather than smile and pretend everything was fine for the sake of the cameras, he made the decision to walk away. It was a powerful moment, a moment that reminded everyone watching that no one, no matter how famous or successful, should have to endure disrespect. That standing up for yourself isn't about being difficult or oversensitive. It's about knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone diminish it. Denise Welch had tried to paint Sean as the problem, as the actor with the fragile ego who couldn't handle tough questions. But the audience, both in the studio and at home, saw right through it. They saw a talented, humble man being attacked for no reason. They saw a host abusing her position and her platform. And they saw someone finally saying enough is enough. The walkout itself was brief but impactful. No screaming, no throwing things, no dramatic gestures. Just a calm, measured decision to leave a situation that had become untenable. It was the kind of exit that spoke volumes precisely because it was so controlled, so dignified. In those final moments before he left the set, Sean had given Denise every opportunity to back down, to change course, to show even a shred of professionalism. But she hadn't taken any of those opportunities. She had continued to push, to provoke, to insult. And in doing so, she had revealed exactly who she was. The other panelists had tried to intervene, tried to steer things back on track, but Denise had talked over them, dismissed them, made it clear that she was in control and she was going to run the interview however she wanted. It was a masterclass in how not to conduct an interview, a cautionary tale about what happens when you prioritize confrontation over conversation. As Sean walked out of that studio, he left behind a host who had just destroyed her own credibility in front of millions of people. He left behind a show that would forever be associated with this ugly incident. But most importantly, he left behind a powerful message about self-respect and boundaries. Because at the end of the day, that's what this was really about. It wasn't about Sean being unable to handle criticism. It wasn't about him being oversensitive or difficult. It was about a line being crossed, repeatedly and deliberately, and someone finally having the courage to say that it wasn't acceptable. The questions Denise had asked weren't probing or insightful. They were designed to belittle, to embarrass, to make Sean look small. And when he didn't react the way she wanted, when he didn't crumble or get defensive in the way she was hoping for, she escalated. She pushed harder, got nastier, tried to provoke a bigger reaction, but Sean didn't give her what she wanted. He didn't lose his temper. He didn't lash out. He simply stated his boundaries, explained why her behavior was unacceptable, and removed himself from the situation. It was a textbook example of how to handle a hostile interviewer with grace and strength. The applause from the audience when he announced he was leaving said everything. These were regular people, daytime TV viewers who had tuned in expecting light entertainment and celebrity chat. They hadn't expected to witness what amounted to a public shaming of a guest. And when that guest stood up for himself, they stood up for him too, metaphorically speaking. That applause must have stung Denise more than anything Sean actually said to her, because it proved that she had misjudged the room entirely. She had thought she was being bold, provocative, unafraid to ask the tough questions. But really, she had just been cruel. And everyone could see it. The way the other panelists reacted told its own story. Their discomfort was visible from the start. They knew what Denise was doing was wrong, and they tried, however ineffectively, to redirect the conversation. But they were also in an impossible position. They couldn't outright contradict their colleague on air, but they also couldn't endorse what she was doing. When Sean finally left, the relief on their faces was obvious. Not relief that he was gone, but relief that the excruciating situation was finally over. They knew they had just been part of something terrible, something that would haunt the show for a long time to come. The commercial break that followed Sean's exit must have been frantic behind the scenes. Producers scrambling, trying to figure out how to handle the rest of the show. Panelists arguing about what had just happened. Crew members exchanging shocked glances. The whole operation had gone completely off the rails, and there was no easy way to fix it. And through it all, Denise had remained defiant. Even as her colleagues challenged her, even as the audience made their feelings clear, she doubled down on her position. She refused to see what was obvious to everyone else, that she had been completely out of line. That refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing, that insistence that Sean was the problem rather than her treatment of him, only made things worse. It showed a stunning lack of self-awareness, an inability to read the room or understand basic social dynamics. Because here's the thing. Even if Denise had genuinely believed her questions were fair, even if she had truly thought she was just doing her job, the moment Sean expressed discomfort, the moment he made it clear he felt disrespected, that should have been her cue to reassess. A good interviewer, a good host, would have recognized that something had gone wrong and adjusted accordingly. But Denise didn't do that. Instead, she mocked him for being sensitive, accused him of playing the victim, suggested he couldn't handle the heat. She turned his legitimate complaint about her behavior into another attack on his character. It was gaslighting in real time, on live television, and Sean saw right through it. That's why he left. Not because he couldn't handle tough questions, but because he recognized that this wasn't about questions at all. This was about a host who had decided to make him the target of her aggression for reasons that had nothing to do with journalism or entertainment. In his final words to her before leaving, Sean had been remarkably composed. He could have shouted, could have matched her hostility with his own, but he didn't. He simply stated the facts. She had been hostile from the start. He had been polite. She had been cruel. That was the truth, and everyone watching knew it. The way he addressed the audience before leaving was particularly poignant. He apologized to them for the uncomfortable situation, even though he was the victim of it. He showed more consideration for the viewers in that one moment than Denise had shown for him during the entire interview. As he placed his microphone down and walked away, Sean Bean demonstrated something important. He showed that you don't have to accept mistreatment just because cameras are rolling or because someone has a platform. He showed that walking away from toxicity is not weakness, it's strength. He showed that you can stand up for yourself without stooping to someone else's level. The image of him leaving that set, head high, while the audience applauded, will remain one of the most memorable moments in talk show history. Not because it was dramatic in the traditional sense, with shouting and chaos, but because it was dramatic in its simplicity. One person saying no to being disrespected, and meaning it. Denise Welch had wanted to create a memorable television moment that day, and she certainly succeeded. Just not in the way she intended. Instead of being remembered as a fearless interviewer who asked the questions others wouldn't, she became the cautionary tale of what happens when you confuse aggression with journalism. Sean Bean, on the other hand, walked away from that disaster with his dignity intact and his reputation enhanced. He had shown the world who he really was, a professional who knows his worth, a person who won't tolerate being diminished, and a man who can handle a hostile situation with remarkable grace.